Hi there, my name is Dr. Daniel Binns. I'm a senior lecturer in media at RMIT University. I'm also an associate investigator with the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society. This is a presentation workshop that I've run a couple of times for symposia and events, but also in classes as well. There are sometimes some extra materials and links that are part of this presentation, so depending on where you're finding this video, you might find some links out to extra materials and tools as well. Before beginning, I'd like to just acknowledge that this presentation was put together on unceded land, on stolen land, the lands of the Woiwurrung and Bunurong language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations. It's the land on which RMIT University conducts its business, and it's also the land upon which I do all my research, all my work, all my creative practice, all my living as well. It's an ongoing struggle for justice and for equality and for reconciliation. This land was never ceded, so I do pay my respects to the traditional and rightful custodians of this land and pay my respects to elders past and present. In terms of who I am, I've looked at all sorts of things over the years. I began with my undergrad in looking at kind of a straight media and communication degree, but with a particular focus on media arts production. I then shifted with my PhD into cinema studies, where I looked at the war film genre. But this is kind of where I'm sitting now. I'm looking at the impact of technology on storytelling and media and screen cultures. I have an interest in the materiality of creative technology. I'm also looking at alternative technoverses and alternative tech futures, including permacomputing and protocols of resistance. And I also, as part of all of this, have an interest in generative artificial intelligence and its use in creative, academic, and everyday workflows and parts of life to put it through its paces to figure out what it's good at and what it's terrible at. And there's a lot in both of those columns. As part of my interest in Gen AI, I've put together a couple of different events online and off around the impact of AI in the creative industries and kind of where we are in terms of understanding the kind of popular or mainstream comprehension of what this technology is and what it can do, and also who's behind those stories and what they have to gain by driving the conversation. So that's kind of where I am at the moment. In terms of reframing, it began with an in-person event in July of 2024 at RMIT, which was also partly connected to Le Laboratoire Paragraphe, which is based in Université Paris 8, Vincennes Saint-Denis in Paris, and with working together with my colleague over there, Everardo Reyes Garcia, who you can see up there in one of the Teams calls. We put on an online version of reframing in October 2024, and we are very likely going to do another edition of this in 2025. But if there is interest in an in-person second event, please do let me know as well. At the moment, I'm very close to finishing a draft article on what I'm calling small AI and weird AI. This is a framing for me to look at some different apps and tools and experiments and case studies where they sit outside the narrative that perhaps the larger tech companies, and particularly the US centered tech companies would have us believe in terms of AI's capacity and its capability and how it's going to change everything and where it's going, right? So the news and the popular commentary around AI is very much driven by just a handful of large tech companies, but of course there are people doing stuff with AI and machine learning outside of those companies and all over the world, and they're doing really interesting and bizarre and fun and creative things with these technologies. So this article, when it eventually comes out, will look at a few examples of that. So when I talk about small AI, I'm looking at small single-purpose AI tools and experimental projects that challenge conventional corporate narratives around artificial intelligence. The features of these tools include being quite private most of the time, or at least being explicit about their privacy. Potentially the capacity to run offline. They're very often open source. The user often has a lot of agency around what they do in the app or tool, and sometimes they're quite strange, and that's fine. We love strange. The examples that I talk about are language models that run offline, so they run locally on your own machines. They may be large language models that run, between 2 gigabytes and 30 or 40 gigabytes, depending on their data sets, or they might be quite small. So, for example, Microsoft's 5.3 model clocks in at about a gigabyte, I think, maybe a little bit less. Tiny Llama, which is a variant on Meta's Llama model, is much, much smaller at around 300 to 600 megabytes, I think. It's also quite terrible. But you're able to run them offline, you can customize them, you can train them to do specific things, and you can also do some weird stuff with running local models. For example, running simulative conversations, or working towards agentic AI, at least kind of nesting some of these tools and models together to work towards, if not true agentic AI, then at least the illusion of agentic AI. So yeah, the benefits of small and weird AI is that very often they're accessible, they're sustainable, they're customizable. There might be a slight tech barrier or barrier to entry in terms of technical knowledge, but it does encourage you to learn and become a little bit more literate in some of these systems, which is, I suppose, a net benefit. Most importantly, they suggest or hint at alternative technological futures through everyday practices and creative resistance. And with that in mind, I've developed a paper that came out late 2024 called The Allure of Artificial Worlds. And it's part of this broader interest I have in AI aesthetics and its connection to the uncanny, its interesting kind of allure and seductive quality and its tactility. But I'm also interested in how it asks us to revisit ideas of machinic agency in terms of how machines imagine or create worlds for us. So AI media depict composite worlds that blur real and fake, the human and the machinic, very much haunted by old media, but they do have their own unique flavour or character. The power and danger of AI is its visceral impact rather than just technical advancement. AI media, so images, video, audio, aren't just computational outputs. This would suggest that they don't have any agency or means to impact media and culture, which they certainly do. Existing knowledge sets and predilections tend to influence your use or your competency or the outputs that you generate. Whereas the interesting thing about AI tools, and particularly AI media generators, is that they work with human knowledge in really interesting ways in terms of mapping and connecting concepts in hyperdimensional space, and the maths involved is just quite insane. What you'll find with general purpose tools, though, is that very often they're trying to kind of get you to the middle or the mean or some kind of average response rather than finding the weird or the uncanny. So part of my, I suppose, work with this workshop and with my research is trying to push the idea that hallucination can and should be a feature rather than a bug. And potentially the thesis that with our current generation, so to speak, of generative AI, where we are at the moment with all of these tools, hallucination is the core feature of this generation and where we are at the moment. And, you know, the big companies would like to stamp that out, but it really is where the interesting stuff happens. So where the interesting stuff happens is often, like I said, just beaten down by corporate interests. So there's obviously in Silicon Valley a growth at all costs mentality, which equates in terms of technical performance and technical innovation to iterating the models at any cost. So even though we may have plateaued at the moment in terms of seeing the huge leaps in model performance that we did between, say, GPT-2 to 3 to 4, with Gen AI at scale, model iteration always means growing, refining, or diversifying the dataset that the models are trained on, adding connections or modifying connections between layers and embeddings in the latent space of the model, increasing the number of iterations that happen during the generation process, whether that's visible to the end user in the interface or not, and adding and refining guardrails. So guardrails are often applied just to the prompt text, although this is changing in terms of bringing some guardrails into the actual mechanism of the models themselves. You may also see iteration in the interface, changing or adjusting the interface to either increase or decrease the sort of amount of user control over the end output. So through all of the above, after these improvements and so-called innovations, I suppose, have gone through on, say, something like Midjourney or DALL-E or whatever it happens to be, the idea, and to a certain extent the reality, is that the outputs that you get are cleaner, smoother, more consistent, perhaps more realistic, but also increasingly homogeneous and samey. The rule of generative AI is that for the most part it will go for the most likely, the average, the middle. It kind of averages out what it assumes the majority of users will want and then gives the user that. And that's true of both media generators as it is for chatbots and so on. So with that in mind, I had this crazy idea of rewilding AI, and that comes from, obviously, the rewilding movement in conservation and environmental sciences. Rewilding sort of takes ideas from a number of different concepts and understandings of conservation. So this idea of core wilderness areas connected by different corridors, passive rewilding in terms of humans just stepping back from whatever ecosystem it is, active rewilding in terms of reintroducing different species of flora and fauna, and these things that are called ecosystem engineers that kind of kick off chain reactions that sort of recomplexify ecosystems. In a way, I suppose it's related to things like urban prairies and urban corridors for species to use. rewilding in the oceans, permaculture, and involuntary parks, all of which make for fascinating reading if you're into eco stuff. But the idea is that in general, it's an environmental technique for restoring and reintroducing natural relationships, interactions, and complexities. And I thought this was an interesting concept to bring to AI, and I suppose I'm not the only one. Eric Salvaggio is a fantastic artist and scholar who's doing a lot of fantastic writing and making in this space, and he talks a lot about different types of breakage in the vein of classic glitch art and data moshing and so on. So for Salvaggio, he looks at moving beyond the aesthetic constraints of AI, a fusion of technical and social breakage. It means manipulating the technical system to assert a different kind of output than what was intended by its makers. It is a risky practice, he says, because it affirms the possibilities of new forms of style from the machines. But as I said, I think that's just baked into our current era, if you like, of generative AI, that it has the possibility to generate bonkers, uncanny, nonsensical, abstract material, and that's part of its architecture. So in terms of the practical side of this presentation, when it's run as a workshop, we have access to a number of different models, but in terms of doing this at home, load up your AI media generator of choice, and I'm just going to run you through what I've called here field studies in rewilding AI that might be provocative or generative, so to speak, but they're often quite fun. So with each of them, you've got the sort of constraints that are that I suggest you put into each platform, depending on what you're using. So for Runway, you've got a certain ratio, a certain resolution. The idea is to remove as many of the perks and extras from each of the platforms so that you're kind of getting an output that is fairly unadulterated in terms of refinements, or a lot of the kind of modern, more contemporary refinements that these models will have. So for style, for instance, always set to kind of none or general. Obviously, if you set it to portrait or to portrait photography, the model's going to be clued in to kind of what you're going for. But I find that the outputs that you get are more interesting if you just reduce the number of variables that you're playing with. So for the self-portrait, the idea is to describe yourself to the machine just using words. So don't put any kind of reference image in or anything like that, and generate 4 images. Keep generating until you get some interesting ones. Add more detail to self-description, and then generate more images. Keep refining, keep playing, maybe with assistance from someone you know. Show them the prompt that you put together, and maybe there's a feature that you just haven't taken into consideration that they can add in to help refine your prompt. And then, when we do this in a workshop, we run a Padlet to share our outputs. But this is the one that I got here on the left hand side when I tried to describe myself. I think you can see me down here in the left hand corner, so I suppose you can decide how accurate it was. But yeah, it's quite a fun activity. The second one is playing with, I suppose, fragmentary language and trying to short circuit the idea of a prompt as being the be all and end all of how to drive these machines. So obviously fix up your settings for Runway or Leonardo. Adapt these settings to, if you're using an open model or a different tool. But the idea is you choose a recent piece of writing that you've done, so it could be an essay or an article or an email that you've sent in the last week that you don't mind someone else seeing. If we're in pairs or if we're in a class situation, I'll then get everyone to swap their laptops with the person next to them, and that person highlights a completely random phrase, a completely arbitrary piece of text from whatever's in front of them. So it could be a complete sentence, or a fragment of a sentence, or a highlight across a break, for example. Swap the laptops back, and then whatever's highlighted is what you use as your text-to-image prompt. So this one that you can see here, for example, I copied and pasted just from an email to a student where I was saying, I can't access your project, I need to mark it. So I just highlighted, you can see I highlighted attached screenshot, full stop, next sentence, it's urgent that I see your project to assess, and that's it. And I just copied and pasted that into Leonardo, and this is one of the weirdo things that it spat back to me. Again, if you're not using any kind of extra guidance, like in terms of style or reference images or whatever, you're going to get more diverse and more interesting outputs, because the model is trying to grab things that match all of the words or symbols that it's seeing in the prompt, but it doesn't have a normal prompt in terms of a description of a scene to generate from. So it might see the words, I see your project, and it'll go, okay, that's a person maybe looking at something, so I'll generate a person and what they might be looking at, but there's no specifics. And it'll put extra bits on, like the flowers and like the border and things that you can see here. So it's kind of an interesting way to force the machine to hallucinate. The third and final field study that we do is unnatural processing. And this is playing around with prompts that have no natural language referent, if that makes sense. So there's no words in these prompts that the model can grab onto and generate things from. The idea is that you generate a random string of 3 characters. I love playing with different kinds of pronunciation of punctuation, so a full stop, an at symbol, and a left bracket, just to see what happens, and then you might generate that 5 times and then change one of the characters and generate another 5 times. And yeah, that's the idea, is that you change one character, repeat, change one character, repeat, and just see the kinds of bonkers images that you get. Sometimes they're completely insane in terms of what you get generated. Other times they're eerily kind of interesting and beautiful. So this one just came from a / and a greater than symbol in it was in Leonardo, but I was using one of the foundation models, so I think I was using a variation of Stable Diffusion rather than any of the kind of proprietary models that Leonardo has now. It's always great to play around with those earlier models because you tend to get more diverse results rather than more refined results, because they're not doing any funky stuff in the background about trying to figure out what you want. And then there's some variations here that I've suggested in terms of finding your favorite emoji or a couple of emojis and using that as your prompt. And then, grab a few favorite ones and upload them to social media. In terms of reflecting on this as an experiment and as a process, it's fun to think about the connection of generative AI to older movements like generative art practice, which has a long history, obviously, but also to glitch art and data moshing. It allows us to think about the biases and assumptions of the models. It allows us to tell different stories about our use of these technologies, because we're not using it in the intended way. And there's always stuff to be learned from these sorts of experiments. And in terms of moving forward, it's this idea of how might breaking these systems encourage more ethical, sustainable approaches, both to AI development, but also to AI usage as well. So with that in mind, I hope rewilding AI was fun, and if you want to keep in touch or chat about any of the other sources and so on that I've been using in Small and Weird AI, in Material AI methods, and in all sorts of other stuff, I'm happy to chat anytime. Thanks so much.